Hello everybody and welcome to another 12 days of Amiga, ranking Amigas from worst to best. Well, I'm just going to get straight on into this video and tell you that in at number 10 today, Pop Pickers is the Amiga CDTV. M. Rochburns has written into 12 days of Amiga with the following comments.
Dear Vicky, I have been enjoying the 12 days of Amiga so far, although I believe that you might be reading Wikipedia a bit too much. But nonetheless, it's come to my attention that tomorrow that you'll be covering the Amiga CDTV. Well, I have bad news for you because the CDTV was never marketed as an Amiga by Commodore. Yours sincerely, M. Rochburns.
Well, thank you for your comments, Mike. I appreciated them and enjoyed reading your letter, but I do have to say that unfortunately you're wrong, because first of all, I'm not reading Wikipedia. I don't have the time to even do that kind of level of research. But secondly, the CDTV was indeed latterly marketed as an Amiga by Commodore, and hopefully I can explain a little bit of a reason why. So what is the CDTV? Well, it's this. It's the Sony RX CD3272. Sorry, no, that isn't actually a CD player, is it? Crikey, I thought that was just some generic Sony CD unit from the early 90s. I don't think we can deny, but the CDTV is actually a reasonably good looker, even in 2022. Yeah, not bad looking actually. So what is the CDTV? Well, it's Commodore's attempt to at last recognise the Amiga was a great platform for multimedia, albeit a little bit too late. Now, it's a hi-fi styled unit with CD-ROM drive and a bevy of Amiga ports in the back, and generally controlled through infrared devices that emulate the mouse and other button clicks and so forth that you would usually initiate through wired peripherals connected to your Amiga. But Commodore went to great lengths to completely obscure the fact that this was based on an Amiga 500. Now, why did they do this? Well, this was their first true foray into home consumer electronics. Their idea was, along with other manufacturers at the same time, was to create a device that could be put into the front room, connected to the TV, and offer up the power of CD-ROM. And this basically meant putting things like encyclopedias, reference books, other edutainment titles, as well as games, in the hands of people sat in their living room. So, a fair enough idea, and I think this is where this begins to underpin why I couldn't put this as my personally worst ranked Amiga, because I actually do have a little bit of begrudging admiration for what Commodore is at least trying to do with this, and also the fact that they did put in some kind of software development to this, so it's not a completely redundant product like the Amiga 1500 or 500 Plus were, for example. So the idea is that you'd put this perhaps with your other sort of hi-fi separates and put it near your TV, and then you could put in your CD-ROM encyclopedia, use the infrared remote and navigate all of that CD-ROM data. 700 floppy disks worth. Quite staggering when we think about it. Still is quite impressive these days, I think we are rather overlook what a revolution CD-ROM was. Anyway, sadly, other people had other ideas. Most people just weren't looking for something like this. The truth is that when people wanted CD-ROM, what did they do? They either bought a CD-ROM drive for their PC, or they went out and bought a PC with one in. And that's pretty much what happened. You know, people weren't looking to necessarily connect their home TV to such a device as the CDTV. They were quite happy with the television being for, you know, basically playing videos or watching terrestrial broadcasts or satellite TV broadcasts, maybe hooking the games console up to it. But really, when it came to computing and doing the serious business of work, a standalone unit was still very much an accepted thing at the time. So, you know, this kind of idea didn't really begin to catch on really until perhaps the PlayStation 2, or maybe the Xbox and so forth, which offered, say for example, DVD compatibility. So, a little bit of ahead of its time, to say the least. So, the reason why I can't rank this as the worst is because Commodore did actually put quite a lot of development into this. For example, the software, though sadly based on Kickstart 1.3, was well designed, relatively speaking. It had a beautiful interface designed by renowned Amiga artist Jim Sachs, with that wonderful spinning CD logo when you turn the machine on, a well thought out CD player panel, and a well thought out preferences panel, all of which settings could be saved into 2 kilobytes of non-volatile RAM. So yes, the interface was pretty decent. And as I intonated, yes, this unit could play CD-ROMs, you know, like just audio CDs, which couldn't be overlooked. I mean, that was quite a big thing at the time, you know, like, oh, not only do I get a CD player, which could easily cost you a couple of £100, but I also get all this other functionality such as CD and G, so CD with graphics, or CD with karaoke subtitles. That has a proper name. I can't remember it now, but yeah, all these kinds of benefits. Plus, I can plug in, you know, sort of CD-ROMs with encyclopedias and the Guinness Book of Records and so forth, as well as other edutainment titles. A fine idea, as I say. Commodore even produced a range of reasonably good peripherals for this, such as a Genlock, various video output modules to enhance the quality of the video output, and also memory cards, which were loosely based off of the emerging PCMCIA standard. Sadly not compatible with PCMCIA, but yeah, they added these little 64 kilobyte or 256 kilobyte cartridges you could plug into the machine to expand the memory or to save information on. Because remember, you can't save to CD-ROM, it's, you know, basically non-writable material. It's ROM, read-only memory.
So this bloke's CD-ROM, how seedy is he?
What?
CD-ROM, how seedy is he?
CD-ROM.
Yeah, that was quite nicely thought out as well. Had a nice little LCD display on the panel, as you can see there.
Right.
Other peripherals such as an infrared mouse and the infrared remote control. And also, the system even included built-in MIDI ports, a first for an Amiga system.
You can tell me, well, actually, I think you'll find that... No.
Commodore was doing a lot of things right with this machine. There was even a Genlock device. Did I mention a Genlock? I think Commodore had finally begun to grasp what the Amiga was good at. But where this fell apart was the fact that it had Amiga 500 underpinnings, which by the time that this was actually launched in April 1991 were, let's face it, beginning to get decidedly dated. I mean, it didn't have 256 colours on screen. I mean, yes, you did have the ham mode, but that has limitations. And sadly, that 7 MHz 68,000 processor is not going to decode full-screen video from CD-ROM in 1991, meaning that whilst Commodore did develop a fantastic little streaming video standard called CDXL with synchronized audio, it was limited to a small postage stamp size on the screen, which, while still relatively impressive at the time, was still not that great, to be honest with you. It was, you know, really, for this thing to fly, full-screen video would have been the way to go, but yeah, Commodore was just so early to market with this. I'm not even sure that the MPEG-1 video standard had been ratified at the time this was launched, let alone having hardware to decode this MPEG-1 or similar full-screen video on the fly. So, yeah, Commodore did develop a reasonably robust platform using basically the underpinnings of Kickstart 1.3 to power this system, but again, why this wasn't really based off of Release 2, we would probably never know. I just guess that Release 2 was just not stable enough really to base the CDTV off. So another point where this begins to fall down is the fact that whilst it's compatible with some Amiga peripherals, you can't just plug in an Amiga mouse or an Amiga compatible joystick with this. No, because it doesn't contain 9-pin joystick or mouse ports. You have to buy a trackball device, infrared, which replicates the remote controls buttons, and on that it has 2 9-pin ports. Just what were Commodore thinking? I mean, they had pretty much included every other Amiga port, but not the 2 that could have really made the system even more usable. It beggars belief. They were just so intent on hiding the fact that this was an Amiga under this, you know, the svelte case that they designed for this. So anyway, needless to say, the CDTV did not sell well at all. It was extremely expensive for Commodore to produce, and the CD-ROM mechanism alone was a custom-designed CD-ROM mechanism manufactured by Matsushita, otherwise known as Panasonic in the West. Well, in fact, it's known as Panasonic in Japan as well, but yeah, Matsushita. And basically, it's not IDE or SCSI, it was custom, and that alone was $400 worth, of equipment, let alone the rest of the bill of whatever that phrase is, bill of goods, bill of something, bill of Amiga bill.
Mr. B. Oddie. This is Bill Oddie. It's not a crank call. Why have you put it down there?
Well, we thought it looked like body.
What's rude about a body?
Tits?
Whatever, you know, bill of thing. Basically, yeah, it was an expensive system to produce. And initially, Manchester, who was basically contracted to manufacture this system, was manufacturing these in Japan, which obviously meant excellent build quality, but also very expensive. Latterly, in 1991, Manchester did actually move their production to their plants or a plant in Taiwan. But by this time, the CDTV was just not selling very well at all, and production ended by 1991 itself. So what to do with all these unsold units? Well, it turns out that basically there was only one thing to do with it. Rebadge it as an Amiga CDTV. Appeal to the audience that would be most receptive to it. And basically what Commodore produced was a range of extra peripherals. They produced a black wired mouse for it, which plugged into the CDTVs, didn't port for those kinds of peripherals, because remember, no 9-pin devices by default. They also produced this rather fetching version of the 1081 disk drive in black, as well as a 1084 monitor in black. So they tried to produce an ecosystem for this that would make it marketable as an Amiga. They advertised in Amiga magazines showing the new Amiga CDTV multimedia pack and various options available, which I've just talked about there. And yes, you could have the black CDTV keyboard, which looked the part. Yes, as I say, a beautiful looking system. But yeah, whilst this did eventually shift through all of the CDTV stock, I would presume Commodore was just making a stonking loss in this machine, which really wasn't helping. See, I'm still fumbling over my words. It's not Wikipedia. I can't be reading Wikipedia because I don't think anybody would write that on Wikipedia. Well, that's all, folks. Anyway, so where was I? Yeah, they were making a stinking loss on this machine, and they even went to the extent of saying, well, if you trade in an Amiga 500, we'll give you £200 off in the UK. They were making a big loss on this machine. It's tragic, really, when you think about it. You know, this is compounded with all the other things that Commodore was doing wrong at the time, and yeah, you can see why basically as soon as they had sold through the stock and the CD32 came along, more on that in another episode, Commodore just dumped this machine like, well, hot stuff.
Hot!
Because the CD32 was compatible with this system. They had no real reason to throw any love towards this system. And yeah, even the Amiga 500 CD-ROM peripheral, which was compatible with CDTV software, the A570, that didn't sell well at all either. In fact, I remember seeing adverts in late 1995 in Amiga format, early 96, knocking out Amiga 570 CD-ROM drives for about 70 quid. I mean, that was nothing. I mean, nigh on unusable, but, you know, and they were being knocked out for that kind of money. That's just how poorly this CD-ROM ecosystem that Commodore was trying to curate did initially, and I admire Commodore for trying. They really did give CD-ROM a shot, but it just goes to show that the marketplace was just a little bit immature for it. And I would go as far as to say that had this had AGA in it, I think it would have fared a little bit better. But I just don't think the Amiga had the strength that it needed, really, to, or Commodore had the strength to market this successfully. I don't think the software development houses had the maturity and the depth in their teams to produce quality CD-ROM software. I think it was there in part, but this suffered from Amiga ports and so forth, which were no different really from floppy disk releases. Tyroken comes to mind on this. Some software was specially adapted for it, like SimCity, and there was the Sherlock Holmes Consulting Detective disc that came out for the CDTV, but really a lot of it was just Amiga software just put onto a CD-ROM. It's a bit of a shame, really, when it comes to the games in that regard. You know, CD-ROM was successful elsewhere in the world. I mean, the PC Engine, phenomenally popular console in Japan, had a CD-ROM attachment developed in 1988. It sold extremely well, and by 1991 we was getting software like Snatcher, ported from the NEC PC series, PC 9801 or something like that. I'm not very familiar about that stuff, so I'm not even going to pretend to know about this stuff. I don't. I just know it exists. But it was ported from those systems, really making the use of that CD-ROM technology. So, you know, some software houses, particularly in Japan, really were beginning to get to grips with how to make the most of CD-ROM technology. But I think in the markets where Commodore was stronger, such as Europe and so forth, I just don't think those software houses had the breadth and the depth to really make good quality CD-ROM software. You know, latterly on the PC and so forth, that began to shine through and so forth, but by that time the Amiga was at its last knockings, really. So I think that also played a role in the CDTV not being particularly appealing in the home market. So I want to wrap up this video now and answer the question of, would I buy one today? Well, if somebody gave me a CDTV, like literally that setup, I would go, alright then, yeah, no problem. But the problem is, it's in many ways, it's just not that usable compared to an Amiga 500 out the box. You know, you don't have all those peripherals that you can easily plug in. You know, it's going to be a shame to butcher that nice floppy drive to have a GoTech in it, although I'm sure somebody has done it quite admirably. You know, and yes, you can buy upgrades for this system, like faster processors and fast RAM, and fit, you know, sort of compact flash cards inside or similar. And also you can get adapters that give you those 9-pin ports. I just think it's a lot of hassle. A very expensive way to enjoy the Amiga ecosystem, I think. I said ecosystem earlier on, didn't I? Sorry, it's just a thing where my brain gets mixed up between Japanese pronunciation and English pronunciation, because E, as we say in English, is in Japanese, and I get confused. Anyway, you don't need to know that. Yeah, the Amiga ecosystem can be enjoyed on other systems much more cheaply than this. I mean, I think this is a beautiful looking system. You know, sadly the keyboards are very rare to find now, because in the late 90s many people cannibalised these black keyboards to use on their spray painted black Amiga 1200 systems, tower systems that people were creating at the time to, you know, just about eke out a bit of extra life from their Amiga 1200 systems. But yeah, a beautiful system, but ultimately a big failure. I think, if I'm to be brutally honest, I feel that this system is a bit of a collector's trophy these days. I can understand the appeal to an extent with this system, but I feel there are much better Amigas out there to enjoy the Amiga ecosystem with in 2022. So that's my thoughts on the CDTV. What do you think? Am I bang out wrong? Was this just entirely rubbish? Was this actually really, really good and nobody understood it? Let me know in the comments. I'll be interested to see what you have to say about the CDTV. As I say, I just think it was a mixture of forces, a lack of support in the marketplace, a lack of decent software, and people just not wanting this stuff, a bit of confusion as to what it really was, and the fact that the Amiga 500 underpinnings just really was a bit of a weak link, I think overall, just meant that the CDTV was pretty much doomed from the off. Anyway, that's all I've got to say about this one. I hope you've enjoyed this edition of 12 Days of Amiga, ranking worst to best. Who knows what's going to be in at number 9? Well, I do, but you're going to have to tune in for that. Anyway, I guess all that remains for me to say is see you soon. Peace!